Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Welcome on this Friday noontime, where we are live at the Riverstone Theatre in London, and of course virtually on all our platforms. And welcome all of those in the future who will be tuning into our podcasts. I'm Humphrey Hawksley, and this is Goldster Inside Story. My fascinating and wonderful guest today will confuse, thrill, and captivate us in the alternate history that she has created in the 1950s around the royal family, European politics, and all that British brouhaha, much of which sounds familiar for the 2020s. She is the creator of Widowland, which you can see on the table there, and now Queen High, two novels described as a publishing phenomenon with a plucky protagonist, Rose Ransom, up against a labyrinthine autocratic system that has emerged from a grand alliance between Nazi Germany and Great Britain. There was no Nazi defeat. SS stormtroopers patrol the streets of London, and women are categorized according to their caste. The confusing element of this comes because the books are written by C.J. Carey, and my guest, waiting in the wings there, carries not that name. And in the mighty United States, Queen High, that you see in green on the table there, carries a different name called Queen Wallis. And many of you might know who that is. My guest is also the author of the elegant and chilling Clara Vine series set in the 1930s in Germany, and the widow of the late great Philip Kerr, creator of the Bernie Gunther detective series. What nuances of Nazism did they discuss over the breakfast table, and what happened when Tom Hanks came to dinner? So much to get through, and welcome Jane Thynne to Goldster Inside Story.
It's great to be here.
You found it all right, did you?
Oh, it's a wonderful place. It's fascinating, isn't it?
It's sort of alternate history in a way.
It feels like the future.
I mean, does anything like this really exist, Riverstone, in
Exactly.
our minds?
Certainly not in 1953.
So we're going to, now anybody in the audience there that's got a question to ask, write it on a piece of paper. Somebody will bring it up to us or put up a hand. And in the audience, any questions for Jane Thynne about anything in the world? She was born in Venezuela. If you want to know about that, just ask her. But I have a question for you to begin with, Jane. What in your alternate history is the Rosenberg classification system?
So we have an alternate London, an England in which Britain and Germany never went to war, but Britain became a German protectorate. And there was a mad, real-life, mad philosopher guru of Hitler's called Alfred Rosenberg, who devised, was a best-selling author, and he devised rather hideous classifications in Nazi Germany. And one of the things he was keen on in real life was the caste system. And so it has come to pass in Britain, Alliance Britain, that he's imposed a caste system, though only for women. So at the age of 16, women are graded into different castes from 1 to 6, of which the elite are called Gellies, nicknamed Gellies after Gelly Raubel, who was Hitler's beloved niece. And they go down, there are Lennys and Magdas and Gretels and Claras. Clara named after Hitler's mother, who is now given the name is given to women with lots of children. And at the very bottom, class 6, come women with no children and no man who are aged over 50. And these are called Friedas. And they live in rundown, unpleasant areas on the edge of town, which are nicknamed widowlands. They're segregated because they're useless to society. So
what class would you be?
Oh, I thought that's such a good point, actually. I'd probably be a Frida. I'd be a Frida.
You'd be a Frida?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, except I have children, so I might escape that. Not. The classification system is fluid, so you can move classes, but most often you're downgraded. So it's and it's all carried out with ruthless efficiency.
Yes.
And I just felt, so the Fridas were inspired for me by a bit of research I was doing about Germany at the end of the war, and there was a civilian rationing system. And I noticed that the people who got the fewest rations were women over 50 who had no man and no children.
Oh my God.
And they had really, really very, very mean rations indeed. And the explanation was that they were just pointless in society. And they were nicknamed in Germany Friedhofsfrauen, which means cemetery women. And so I took that name and I used it for my Fridas. But of course, women over 50 are always going to be the most literate section of society. And so actually my Fridas become heroines in the novel.
Now, I have to ask this. How much does that caste system reflect what continues in Britain against the class system here?
I was very focused on women, and I think that there actually is now quite a big debate about the invisibility of women in later life, or even just post 50. And actually, there's an interesting book called Hags has just come out about how women in this demographic have been kind of almost stigmatized. In America, they're called Karens,
Really?
and there is it's permitted to hate certain classes of women. And I think that there's a lot of disdain towards older women. And I wanted to kind of harness that and channel it, because obviously I feel very differently. And I wanted to bring this older woman demographic to the fore.
That's brilliant. That's a very Goldster thing to do, I've got to say, actually. But if we could just step back a second, because I want to get the atmosphere and geography right. If we step out onto the river here, that many of you might have done, and you've got Wandsworth Bridge to your right, and you're looking up towards Chelsea and the city on your left and the River Thames. Under the Grand Alliance in the 1950s, what would it feel like and what would we see?
So what you would see in Alliance Britain is 3 women to every 1 man, because what has happened is that the men of working age have gone on something called extended national service to work on the mainland, and so very much fewer men and far more women. And you would say things are dingy, things are less pleasant than they would be, because, for example, all the best materials, all the best woods have gone to Germany. A lot of raw materials, all the best food stuff. So what you might see is people illicitly angling in the river because people want to supplement their rations. But what you would have seen in 1953, the moment in which I have actually set Widowland, would be bunting along the embankment, because it was the coronation coming up.
Oh, right. And so what would the symbols of the bunting be?
They would be little triangles with the alliance symbol.
With the, was that the swastika?
It's got an alliance. I had such fun doing this. So the alliance symbol is a red and black symbol, and you've got the British lion, but on the top of the British lion is the German eagle, and he's kind of sinking his claws, so it's kind of ambiguous. The lion looks nervous. Yeah. So that's the alliance symbol, and you'd see that because the germ of Widowland was that I wanted it to be set in coronation year, but not the coronation of Queen Elizabeth, coronation of Edward and Wallis. I regard the abdication of Edward VIII as one of the really big what-if questions of the 20th century. I think if he hadn't abdicated, Britain would have followed a very, very different path. And the more we discover about Edward VIII and his predilections, which coming out even recently and today, we see that he would have agreed to an alliance, and that he would have been quite amenable to the idea of being a puppet ruler.
And so were many of the politicians at the time, weren't they? I mean, there was a whole faction that thought there should be a peace deal.
Yeah. So Halifax was almost prime minister in Widowland. Halifax in 1940 is prime minister, not Churchill, and that would have been the wish of the king at the time. But as it happened, we got Churchill instead. So I see it as just a tilt on the rudder of history, that we actually went the way that we did, and that we didn't have We didn't have Edward and Wallace, but I thought it'd be very interesting. I almost think it's a sort of duty of historians to explore what if scenarios, because they teach you about history. For a long time, the whole genre of alternative history has been a bit sort of frowned on, a bit sort of disdained.
You're punching through that ceiling. Is there an alternate history ceiling that you've punched through? I want to get back to because I want to get onto the coronation a bit later, because there are so many parallels here, it's going to have us rocking in our seats. But tell us who Rose Ransom is.
So Rose is our protagonist, and she is a Gelly. She's won the kind of golden ticket in the Rosenberg classification system, and she's come out as 1A, which is great for her. And it means that she's got a job at the Culture Ministry, and she's been given a job which is to rewrite the classics of English literature. Now, I need to tell you where this came from, because it came from a real thing. When Alfred Rosenberg was advising Hitler, one of the things he did in the war was he set up an SS task force that went through occupied Europe and private libraries and homes, seizing history books. And the SS task force were scholars, and they would rewrite the history books to reflect National Socialist ideology. They corrected them. And so Nazis didn't just burn books, they actually thought there's a better and more sophisticated way of doing this. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if Britain was a protectorate? What would you do about English literature? Particularly the great classics like Jane Eyre and Middlemarch and Pride and Prejudice, which are all about women finding agency and standing up to masculine superiority. And that can't be allowed. That's very much not compliant with Nazi ideology. So Rose, young, hasn't read anything really, not a great reader, is given the job of just correcting these novels and just dumbing down Lizzie Bennet and making Dorothea Brooke a bit less.
Give us an example in Jane Austen's and Charles Dickens, something that would be familiar to all of us, what she would have changed.
Jane Austen, for example, she has to rewrite Emma, and there's a character in Emma called Harriet Smith who sets her cap at the clergyman, and it all works out. Emma encourages this romance, and it all works out terribly. And it's not that particular character, but Harriet Smith has dreams above her station, and in the novel it doesn't pan out, but Rose needs to make it much more clear that it's not okay to have dreams beyond your caste. She needs to in Jane Austen's Emma, actually Harriet Smith has learned something about human nature, and it's been sort of a kind of nuanced learning experience. That can't be the case. It has to be much, much clearer that it's.
Now, we were talking about this earlier, but I can't stop myself asking this question, because now they have sensitivity editors. They have people like Rose in the publishers at the moment, interpreting what the sensitivities of early 21st century British readers are, changing things like Middlemarch and Jane Austen. And
This is a huge, huge issue. And indeed, I've had experience of this close up, which astonished me. When I wrote Widowland, the Americans rung up and they said, look, we've got some problems. And I said, oh, really? And they said, we just feel there's a few instances in which you have correlated bodily image with negative personality characteristics.
Can you repeat that?
What are you talking about? And they said, yeah, so bodily image must not be correlated with negative personality characteristics. And I said, can you explain? And they said, you've got 3 fat Nazis. Can you remove 2 of them? Can you make 2 of them thin? So, do you know what? I did because actually I thought having fat Nazis felt a bit of a cliche, but it was a kind of weird moment. So, for example, what happens in the novel, Rose has to correct Heathcliff, because
Right. Wuthering Heights, we're talking
in
about.
Wuthering Heights, Heathcliff is kind of, is we're not really sure of his origins, but he's certainly got a kind of dark complexion, and nobody quite knows where he's come from, etc. And so it's not okay to have a non-Aryan union at the center of a romance in Alliance Britain. But when I wrote Widowland, I had no idea that 3 years later we would be opening the paper and seeing almost every day, it seems, instances of correcting James Bond or P.G. Wodehouse, and the acceleration of literary censorship has just astonished me.
It is. No, I mean, the way you put it there against what you've written and Rose's job, it's actually chilling me as we talk. The story now, that was a tangent that I went. Geeta is asking some questions, which should we get onto now? Yes, let's go onto it now, and then I'll get back to the book. What lit up your interest in Germany? Do you have any family links?
Yeah, one of my grandmothers was German. That's as far as I can go. But I've been interested in Germany since. So, well, actually, I can reference Philip here. So my late husband wrote a series set in Germany with a Berlin detective set in the war. And so I was always very interested in politics of the Second World War, and it all seemed to be very male orientated. It was about war, it was about Goering, it was kind of a super masculine story. And I always wondered what it was like for the women, and particularly the VIP women. I was very interested in those because I stumbled across the story of Magda Goebbels, who was the wife of Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister in Hitler's regime. And Magda was, when she was young, she had a Jewish stepfather and she had a Zionist boyfriend. So she learnt Hebrew, she wore a Star of David, and they had plans to go to Palestine together to found a state of Palestine. And this man, Victor Alosrov, went off to Palestine on his own to kind of lay the way in 1930, and Magda was left behind in Berlin, and she went to a talk, and the talk was given by Adolf Hitler, and she fell in love at that moment with Hitler. And Hitler was very attracted to her, but felt that he could never marry her because he had to be married to Germany. So he introduced her to Joseph Goebbels. Must have been a huge disappointment. In fact, it was. And she married him instead. She married him. And in 1933, April 1933, 2 years after they got married, Victor Alosrov came back from Palestine to Berlin. And he walked down the street and he looked in a window and he saw a wedding photo. And it was his erstwhile girlfriend Magda marrying the arch persecutor of the Jews, Joseph Goebbels, with you know who as best man. And he was so shocked. He got in touch with her, which was an incredibly dangerous thing to do. And we don't know what passed between them. All we know is that he was murdered 3 months later. But I always thought, how interesting to have a go-between. If you could have a fictional go-between who would actually carry messages between them, it would be an interesting way of looking into the life of a woman like Magda Goebbels, who'd undergone this kind of huge, kind of convulsive change in her life. And I wanted to know whether the VIP women would be supportive of their husbands or whether they would actually try and dissuade them. And actually, it was a real life incident as well. At the time, there was a woman called Asma al-Assad, al-Bashir, al-Assad, who was married to Bashir al-Assad. Right. And Asma grew up in Ealing and went to school in London. And she's same age as me. And she married the dictator of Syria. And I thought, what is it like? What will it be like to have the same background and education and to go out and be married to somebody who perpetrates a level of bloodshed like this? And that got me thinking about the other Nazi wives. And they all, interestingly, reacted in different ways. There was the wife of Goering, for example, Emmy Goering, used to try and get her, she was an actress, and she used to get Jews to safety in a most extraordinary way, because Goering's older brother ran a film studio in Austria, and she would ring him up, Albert Goering, and she would say, look, I've got some Jewish friends, you need to take them in, and then you need to get them to safety. And Hermann Goering knew all about this, and they would rescue, she and Albert would rescue Jews in this way.
It's incredible.
And rather kind of sadly, there's a sort of epilogue to this, which is that after the war, when the Americans came in and captured that particular bit of Germany, I don't mean captured, but occupied, they arrested Albert Goering, and his name was Goering, and they said he'd kept the paper, he'd kept the addresses of 34 Jews who he'd rescued. He handed over their names and said, just contact these people. And they did, and the Jews said, he saved our lives. And he is commemorated as righteous amongst Gentiles in Jerusalem.
Good grief.
But he died a pauper because he refused to change his name.
This is the basis of your Clara Vine series, isn't it? That you've just
yes,
outlaid.
sorry, I've gone off
and you'll go between. No,
yeah.
it's fine, because before we did Widowland and before you did Queen High, you did a brilliant series of a young British actress model that got caught up in this thing and became the messenger and all that sort of thing. And that was what drew you into this whole thing. And I have a question, two questions of your character. You can take your tea if you want, because I can, because we have Hitler that you mentioned, it's quite graphically there, in Widowland and Queen High and the Grand Alliance. Where is he in all this?
So he's never named. He's never named because the whole exercise of Widowland and Queen High, I make it sound a bit depressing as an exercise. I don't mean it like that. But because I'd spent a lot of time sort of imaginatively living in Nazi Germany, I'd always wondered what it would be like if that regime had come to Britain. But I didn't want to make it, I didn't want to use Hitler because I wanted to make it a bit more generic. You know, I didn't, also I think kind of Hitler kind of kills something somehow. So he's just referred to as the leader. And he's not, this is his, in Widowland, he makes his first ever visit to Britain, which is...
He's the leader of the protectorate, isn't it?
He's the leader, yes.
The alliance, but you don't describe, do you describe him at all? Do we get a...
Right at the end, because he comes, the interesting thing about Hitler was when he was obsessed with Paris before the war and they occupied Paris, absolutely obsessed, and he had a model, a scale model of Paris, and he would pore over this model, memorizing the streets. I mean, he was, you know, really interested in the architecture. And then when they actually occupied Paris, he visited it once, just once for 16 hours, and that was it, just in and out. And he said, I don't need to see Paris, it's all in my mind. And so in Widowland, it's been 13 years since the Germans formed an alliance, and he still hasn't visited, and he's finally going to visit to attend the coronation.
And he comes for the coronation, and we stop telling the story there, don't we? Because that'll be what they call a spoiler in the trade. Before has anybody got any questions about the dystopian alternate history? Because we're going to move on to the monarchy in a moment. Any questions from?
We had one question that was passed to us here.
Okay.
But I don't know that it's about the dystopian thing.
It can be about anything, because we could do Venezuela, couldn't we, Jane?
So it says, born in Venezuela, please revisit in your fiction, co-author with Humphrey. What sources do you use, and what responses are you getting from professional historians?
Okay. What sources do you use for your research, and what responses do you get from professional historians?
It's so frightening. That's literally the most frightening thing. Well, it's, you know, they've been kind of generous, I would say. Obviously, I've kind of my entire, having lived with Philip, who'd written 14 books set in Nazi Germany, basically, our entire house, we must have 3,000 books, lots of them which have the word Hitler on the spine. And my children made a massive fuss because when their friends come round, all the bookshelves have got books about Hitler, and they say, "Oh, Mum, turn them around so you can't see the spine." And I said, "Well, it'd be great if we ever get burgled. You know, the burglar's going to run really fast." But it gets where if I ever have to do Zooms, I always have to be really careful about the bookshelf
Yes,
because
absolutely.
it looks freaky. So I've read an awful lot.
But the sort of, you know, when you write fiction, I mean, I'm a journalist, so I write fiction. And I keep thinking, well, it is fiction. I can make it up. But then my peers from journalism are going to come in and saying, well, that's wrong. That would never happen. That sort of thing. Do you get this from the sort of academic Second World War historians? Do they say, come on, Jane, that would never happen? That's
What
brilliant.
I did, it was a very serious thing, because when you're writing about World War II, and particularly the Holocaust in tangentially, that's really serious, and you don't want to make big mistakes there, because you've got, I think it behoves you to take it very seriously. So when I wrote the Clara Vine series, I was really careful about events and dates and times and things. But the great thing about alternative history is you don't have to, you can make it up. But I did change my name. I changed my name because I thought I've put so much effort into being really precise historically that now I'm going to say ridiculous things. I think I'll say it under a different name. And the publishers were thrilled. They said, when you change your name, make sure you write with initials so people might think you're a man. And I said, oh, why? And they said, well, because men don't like buying books with women's names on them, on the covers, because they might be seen buying a book by a woman. And so therefore, if you've just got initials, you're going to be better placed to have male readers. And it has proved so.
It's worked.
It has worked.
So you're selling better than Clara Vine because of the
much. These two have sold much better, yeah. Because, well, partly because they're set in England, and
yes,
people like to know about their own world.
Yes,
but partly I think also monarchy has played into it.
But whilst we're talking about the marketing, so you changed your name, but also you had a fascinating conversation about Queen High with your American publishers, didn't you?
This is really, this is so Humphrey and I are always talking about in the kind of like the niche publishing kind of, you know, mad world of publishing. When I went out to America and I said, here's my book, it's called Queen High, they said, yeah, we hate that title. I said, okay. They said, we want to call it Queen Wallace. And I said, I really hate that title, actually. And they said, and I was in the headquarters of the publisher, and they said, okay, we're bringing in the geeks. And in came a variety of people who run algorithms. And they explained to me, for example, you have 3 seconds between the moment somebody picks up the book and whether they put it down again or not. This 3 seconds is very, very important. So the title is kind of everything. And they'd focus grouped titles, and the title Queen Wallace registered 73% more than the title Queen High. So I had 73% more possibility of somebody picking it up even. And I just said, okay, fine, just call it whatever.
Yeah. I mean, but that didn't translate. You didn't then call it Queen Wallace over here for the same reason.
No, it had already been published here.
Oh, okay. So you no choice on that, or changing it. Tell us who Wallace Simpson was.
So Wallace Simpson was the woman who eventually married Edward VIII. She'd been married once, and she was married to her second husband by the time she was introduced to him. Her first husband had been a naval officer and had been sent to China, and it's called Win Spencer. They were quite badly off, and Wallace had learned to play poker very well and made a lot of money playing poker out in China. And this is tremendously significant because to my plot. Anyhow, she got rid of Win. She married a richer man called Ernest Simpson, and they came to London. She was introduced to Edward VIII, who I'm sure you know all the story, felt passionately in love with her. She was not as passionately in love with him and probably didn't want to marry him, but it came to pass. And in in real life, as we know, he abdicated in 1936, and they went to France and married in 1937. But in my novel, they haven't. They've become king and queen. And
he doesn't.
I thought,
I think so he becomes king, but he abdicates before the coronation, doesn't he? Because you can't abdicate after a coronation.
Then he's brought back.
Yes.
But then in Queen High, he's died, and she's a widow. And I thought, what American royal figure who hates Britain and is longing to go and live in California can I think of? And then I thought of one, and I thought, I'm just going to channel this particular female character a lot into Wallis, because it made a lot of sense. The parallels are so striking. People often say history doesn't repeat, but the repetitions between Edward and Wallis and Harry and Meghan are enormous.
Can I read a bit from in the book, in your acknowledgements, I think it is, there was a book that Wallis Simpson wrote called The Heart Has Its Reasons, ghostwritten. And in it, she says that there was something steely and inhuman in the monarchical principle. And she goes on, she hated her unpopularity. We all remember how Camilla was. And nothing shook me so much or hurt me more than the discovery of the scorn or even the hatred that many felt for me. That could come from Meghan, couldn't it?
It absolutely could. But I mean, I suppose the difference is that Wallis didn't really weaponize it. She did accept that they were going to live in exile, albeit unwillingly. In fact, there's a marvelous moment when 1940, the troops of Hitler have occupied France and the Low Countries, and they're coming down through France. People, Wallis and Edward take refuge in Lisbon in Portugal, which is neutral at that time. And Winston Churchill is incredibly alarmed and says, you need to get on a boat. I'm sending a boat to the harbour and you're going to the Bahamas. And Wallis won't get on the boat. And Churchill has been warned by many of his spies, including, interestingly, Ian Fleming, that there's a plot against Edward and Wallis, a German plot, and they're going to kidnap Edward and Wallis and take them back to the Reich. And this is a real plot, and they planned the car, and they'd taken the internal handles out of the car so they wouldn't be able to get out. And it was all in motion, and Wallis wouldn't get on the boat. And eventually, they found out why Wallis wouldn't get on the boat. And it was because she knew she was going to the Bahamas and it was going to be warm, there was going to be a pool, and she had a fantastic swimming costume that she loved, and she'd left it in the south of France. And she wasn't going until she got a swimming costume. So the American consul in Nice was sent back to the south of France to fetch her special swimming costume. and eventually she got on the boat. But it's such a fascinating period. I've now entirely lost track of your question.
No, the question was answered, but Geeta has a question. Thank you, Geeta, for how old were you when you decided you wanted to be an author? And were you also attracted to other careers?
Yeah, I was probably 15, and I wanted to be a doctor, but I used to write a lot of stories, and I signed up to do science A-levels to be a doctor. And then I went on holiday with my uncle, who was a literature professor, and he spent the whole holiday gossiping about English literature. And I went back to school and changed my A-levels. And I've always felt I had this kind of phantom doctorish limb. And I slightly, often throughout my career, I've wished I'd stayed being a doctor.
Did you write a book at 15? That's sitting in a drawer somewhere?
Yes,
You did?
Lots, yes.
Lots of books at 15?
Yep, I used to write books. We had a kind of part work, like a kind of Dickensian part work at school, where the teachers were various characters and they were passed around, and it was fun.
Yes,
yeah.
and will any of them ever see the light of day?
Certainly not.
But they still exist, so they'll go into your archives, will they?
Together with all the poetry, Humphrey.
Let's get back to the monarchy, because it's fascinating. As you were writing this, I presume all of this Harry, Meghan stuff was going on. Yeah. The Queen was getting frailer and frailer. Charles and Camilla were doing their thing. Andrew's thing must have happened. What were you bouncing around your apparent alternate history, but this very real world that was happening?
It was incredible. I was very interested. So in Queen High, what happens in the plot is that at last, 1955 we're in now, Eisenhower is making a state visit to the alliance, signaling a kind of rapprochement, and they're obviously going to meet the widowed Queen Wallis, but they're super worried. The authorities are very worried that Wallis, who's fed up, kind of semi-alcoholic, is not going to be a fantastic ambassador for Alliance Britain. And Rose is sent in to kind of get a feel for what kind of things she'll say. And Rose goes to Buckingham Palace and meets Wallis. And Wallis is really, she absolutely hates the authorities, and they hate her back, because actually the Third Reich was very anti-monarchy. They believed it was kind of archaic, and they wouldn't have perpetuated it at all, except in an entirely cynical way. So Buckingham Palace has become denuded, all the decent stuff's been taken away, and she's there alone, drinking cocktails at 10:30 in the morning, plotting.
Oh my God! So a sad dystopian figure
But
rambling around Buckingham Palace,
yes.
and her president technically is coming over to visit.
Eisenhower's coming over to meet everybody, but she has a document that is so explosive that it will blow the rapprochement out of the water. And
this is where we stop because of the spoilers.
Yes.
So and what's Rose doing in all this? Can we?
So Rose is still, after the dramatic end of Widowland, she's still amazed to find herself in her job at the Culture Ministry. She's now censoring poetry. And this was I really drew on Stalin in this, because Stalin was very worried about poetry as well, and did a lot of censoring of poetry. And the East German Stasis went even further and trained up Stasi agents to write their own poetry so that they could be promoted. And in the alliance, in my book, poetry has become outlawed, because poetry is imprecise, it carries messages, it's like a code. It's
full of dreams, isn't it? It's full of ambition and dreams.
They don't like it. Yeah. And so they're also very worried. So the only poetry that's allowed is poetry's really famous, like Wordsworth's Daffodils. And even then, Rose has to rewrite it, because yellow flowers are the symbol of the resistance, and daffodils are, a nightmare. So Rose rewrites it with Edelweiss in it instead. I wandered lonely as a cloud, something cross hill and rise, and all at once I saw a crowd, a host of snowy Edelweiss. And it's kind of complicated. She has to rewrite, and Jerusalem, nightmare, William Blake. So it's kind of yes, that's her job. But, and this I took straight from Stalin's Russia, underground poetry networks have sprung up where people just meet to read poetry to each other, and this is a very subversive activity. And so she goes along to these, and
she goes along to these, but she's also got this sort of quite senior job.
She's appointed a poet hunter, because the authorities have worked out that there will be subversion in this network, and she's sent in to spy on them. But of course, she is herself living a double life.
You mentioned Jerusalem. I have to ask this question. Was there a last night of the proms under the Grand Alliance?
No, I don't care. They're far too nationalistic. I mean, so what's also happening is that Albert Speer, who was Hitler's architect, who rebuilt a lot of Berlin, has been brought over to rebuild London, because London's full of kind of old medieval stuff. Don't need it. Doesn't look good. And so he's putting a huge brutalist Via Triumphalis through the centre of London, and it's going to be called Londinium.
Londinium, it's called. Gita is pushing you. What was your first book at 15 about?
I think it was about the RE teacher, so you really don't want to know that. And then I used to write. I mean, I was very interested in the 1920s even then, and 1930s. So I used to write about characters from
Yes.
them.
And do you dream of your storylines?
I wish. Oh, I wish. That would
Do you
be
wake
great.
up with the next
That'd
scene
be
in your head?
fantastic. No,
No.
I do go running, and I find when I go running, that's a good time. Ideas do come into your head.
Together. Now you meant you were married for many years to Philip Kerr, who sadly died in 2018, but he created the Bernie Gunther detective series. You were doing Clara Vine at some of that time, and the rest of it. What was it like, sort of getting up in the morning and having all these Nazi thoughts banging around in both of your heads?
Well, it wasn't so much Nazi thoughts. It really was like 1930s and 40s thoughts. But what was incredibly useful about being married to a writer was that, for a start, I mean, one of the great things about Philip was that he was the first person that made me think that actually writing for as a profession or a career was completely serious and possible to do. Because previously I'd gone out with people who didn't write, and it was considered a hobby. And so that it was like being given permission in a way to actually just pursue it properly as a career. But what was also good was that he was really good at plot. So we'd sit down after the children had gone to school every morning. We would sit down, have a cup of coffee, and talk about our books. Mostly about his books, actually. I don't know why that would be, but something male about that. But anyhow, we'd talk about what we were writing, and he was brilliant at plot, and I was more character. And I would always say, put more women in your books, because he'd write a whole book and it had like 2 women in it. And I think actually readers are interested in human relationships, and so. But he would be superb. He would come up with a plot twist that you would never think about. And I have to say now, I very kind of poor substitute. I sometimes talk about my plots with my children, and they, like the middle one, Charlie, will say something like, "And if a zombie came along?" And so, that's sadly.
Are any of them writers?
Yeah, Charlie is a writer. Charlie is a writer. Yeah, Naomi writes. I mean, 2 out of 3 are writers.
2 out of 3 are writers. So the now I think, correct me if I'm wrong, is that the Bernie Gunther series has been optioned for Hollywood, and Tom Hanks is one of the producers. And one day he called up and said he wanted to drop round for supper. Is that right?
This was, yes. So Tom Hanks loved the Bernie Gunther series and bought it through his company. And I remember Philip coming in one morning and going, I've got to go out to, he was going to the Bristol Crime Fest. I'll be out all day. I don't know what time I'll be back. Tom Hanks is coming for dinner. And I said, what are you talking about? And he said, yeah, he's coming for dinner here. And I said, can't we go to a restaurant? And he said, no, Tom just likes private homes. And I spent all day, I thought, what do I give him? I spent half the day cleaning and the other half of the day like going to Marks and Spencer's, and I pathetically bought lobster and pavlova was my kind of choice. I thought maybe that's a kind of film starry thing. And Philip was late, didn't come back. Tom Hanks turns up, who is literally the nicest man you could hope to meet. Very, very well read, extremely lovely man. And finally, we get round to having the dinner. After he's entertained all the children by doing, he said, ask me to do a voice. I'll do any voice. And so the kids were going, be Woody or, be Forrest Gump. And he was so funny. And anyhow, we get round to having dinner and I bring out the lobster. And he goes, oh, I'm really sorry. I can only eat an undressed green salad. I'm diabetic. So, I can't eat anything except a bit of lettuce. And it was just like, I kind of shamefacedly put all the rest of the stuff away.
Did you have any lettuce? Did you have any salad?
I scurried away looking for lettuce. No, he was really nice. He was really nice. And that I have to be really careful about what I say, but I'm hoping that will be coming to fruition very soon.
Yes, it's a thing. And anything on the Widowland and Queen High?
So both have been optioned, and we're and 2 lots of scripts have been written. and also the Clara Vine series has been scripted as well. So we shall see.
Yeah. Well,
Hollywood takes forever. It's a long thing.
Hollywood takes forever,
It
and
really
I think
does.
the good agents tell you not to, just sign it and then forget it until something actually happens. We're talking about the dystopian world. You have peers like Philip Dick and the Man in the High Castle, Margaret Atwood, and The Handmaid's Tale, and that sort of thing. Give us an idea of what this genre of literature is like that you've.
So what I think is interesting is that alternative history, science fiction, and dystopia are this huge burgeoning sector, whereas say 20 years ago, the psychological realism novel was kind of where it was at. Suddenly, that everybody's taking science fiction and dystopia seriously. And my theory is that because we live in a rather uncertain world and the future seems wide open. I mean, if you think about AI, what's going to happen with AI, artificial intelligence, or who would have said even 5 years ago that we would be having a mainland European war? So I think the future seems really uncertain. And for that reason, people are more ready to sort of think outside the box. And that's what science fiction does. And that's what alternative history does. So for that reason, if you look back at times, for example, the 1930s, when you had John Wyndham, who was writing The Midwich Cuckoos, or he wrote lots and lots of books, but the Crake and Wakes and things, that was a time of uncertainty too. So times of uncertainty let people think differently.
And the science fiction, though, which John Wyndham was sort of science fiction, and then you get the big science fiction like Dune. I think they just made it, where you have these whole new worlds coming in. This is something that we go to when we live in times of uncertainty, is it?
Or when we want to escape. So I think if you think about video games, which are lots about alternative worlds and fantasy worlds, people just want to escape. Even if you think of Tolkien, who was writing in the Second World War, he was writing about a kind of fantasy world which you could escape to. He wasn't writing about how grim it is living in wartime Britain. He was transporting you. So I do think that.
Yes. So you can get out of the. Jean Shanley asks, who are your favourite writers and why? Give us 3.
Oh, that's so difficult.
It's a tough question, isn't it?
Well, I mean, I was thinking recently, my favourite writers are probably poets, actually. And so William Blake would be right up there. Very good example of somebody who had thought extensively about imaginative alternative lands. William Wordsworth I'm very, very fond of, because what Wordsworth did was he tried to, I think, understand that there was something sublime about nature that went beyond just our straightforward ideas about God and religion. He tried to get in touch with something that was sort of numinous. I think he's very interesting and profound. I suppose Phil has to be my third, But and I mean there are millions and millions. I'm just discovering, because I'm writing a novel set in 1938 now. Writers like Dorothy Whipple. I don't know if anyone knows her, but they were sisters or someone at a distance. Dorothy Whipple is amazing, and she's completely neglected, and she's just coming back into consciousness. She's a fantastic writer.
We have a comment really from Emma, which I think reflects what we've been saying. Listening to you makes me convinced of the cliche that history repeats itself. The characters you talk about seem to have come to life in modern life, as if the spirit of dead reincarnation comes up. I mean, it is really a sort of.
That's because human beings haven't changed psychologically. So if you look at Harry and Meghan, and you look at Wallace Simpson and Edward, what you've got is a very powerful woman, and you've got a man in both cases who feels wounded in some way. So Edward VIII felt that he had a very domineering father, which he did, and quite a strong mother, and he felt misunderstood, and he was looking for somebody, and there you are, he met his match, a very strong and dominant woman who could mother him. And I think with Harry, who I haven't met, so I'm just speculating here, but I've read his book. He also was wounded, looking for somebody who was going to give him direction, and he met this incredibly strong, opinionated woman who has very much directed his life. And so I think it's human nature that repeats itself, and that therefore events and politics can change, but you get the same humans doing the same things.
And the structure or mindset of the royal family seems not to have changed that much at all. Of course, Charles has been allowed to marry Camilla, which wasn't allowed back then, but the way that Queen Wallis describes that family is a mirror of what we're seeing now, isn't it?
Yeah, she saw it as a cage. Wallis Simpson was, we all know, really disliked by our Queen Mother, and she referred to Britain as the island. She could hardly bring herself to use the word Britain, and she despised the Queen Mother and was very, very much despised in return. And so that animosity, has repeated a little, but it's a very dysfunctional setup.
It is, isn't it? And that actually, just a point that you just made there about the wanting to be mothered and loved, because we know that sort of distant mothering that happens in the royal family is that there is this craving in the human condition to feel safe with somebody, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that I can't really speak about Harry except having read his book, but I do think with Edward VIII, he was a very complicated individual, and it must have been really awful for Wallis to be married to him. He couldn't bear to let her out of his sight. He was very, very clingy and needy, threatening to kill himself. If she left him, she wouldn't have chosen to marry him, but actually she had some sort of shred of maybe duty or obligation that finally made her realize she was going to have to spend her life with him.
Goodness. Wait here for 1 second, because I'm going to tell everybody what we have coming up next. If anyone's got any questions, thoughts, comments, or you just want us to get out and have a glass of wine, let us know whilst I do this. April 27th, that is next week, I am with Peter Popham and his boundary-breaking novel, India Be Damned. That's about the partition. It's a fictional account of India's violent partition in independence, something else we got a bit wrong, isn't it? And then by hair's breadth of a popular vote, our book of the month, which is unrecorded, so anybody that joins in can say what they want, Franz Kafka's Metamorphoses, the salesman who one day wakes up as a cockroach and the family tensions that follow that. That beat Richard Osman's The Bullet That Missed, actually, in our popular vote. They were the two. Not to say that Goldster doesn't swing to extremes. May the 4th, Lucinda is with Lisa Edwards. Dark Horses Ride, One Woman's Journey into Midlife and Menopause. And May the 5th, Lucinda is back again with Barbara Black's Hotel London, How Victorian Commercial Hospitality Shaped a Nation and Its Stories, looks at London's grand hotels, which would be Claridge's and other hotels like that, as a culturally intimately connected to the urban landscape. And on May the 11th, I'm with Alan Bardos, who is with us now. Where are you, Alan? Show us your thing. Alan Bardos with his great First World War series featuring a renegade, flawed and swashbuckling hero called Johnny Swift. Have you read Kafka?
Yeah.
What do you think about Kafka, Jane?
Love it. Love Kafka.
Should our Goldster readers...
Yeah, Metamorphosis is very, very short as well.
Is it? We like to do short books, you see.
It's very good.
Yeah, it's good. And I mean, just imagine waking up as a completely different person.
I know. So Kafka was living in a very complicated political time, and absolutely used that metaphor fantastically. He was somebody who very much thought outside the box. I mean, he obviously also wrote The Trial and The Castle, which are both about labyrinthine, psychologically maddening worlds which are different from our own. I think actually the Czechs are even more screwed up than us, actually.
And is he being rewritten by sensitivity editors? Do we know?
what, cruelty to cockroaches?
Yeah, it's
Who
cruelty to
knows? I mean,
cockroaches. The cockroach, minority will be.
I think nobody's safe. I mean, it's a serious, actually, serious issue. There's a piece in the paper this morning that says 1 in 3 librarians has been asked to remove books. And I take it really seriously, because it's not just about whether somebody in the 19th century used a phrase that we now consider unacceptable, and therefore we want to fix history by going back and changing it. What I really find worrying is this phrase, "there is no debate." So, which anyone who's lucky enough to have Gen Z children will have heard. There's no debate. But of course, civilization is debate, and you don't get any intellectual life without debate. And it's a hallmark of authoritarian societies that you're not allowed to have debate. So by all means say, James Bond is sexist and we're finding that traumatic, readers find that traumatic or triggering, whatever you're going to say about it. But you need to put it out in the open. Don't do it without doing it openly, so that people have the chance to talk about it.
Who's saying no debate?
Well, I can tell you haven't got Gen Z children. It is absolutely the motto. It's a motto.
Really?
It's a slogan.
This is the younger generation coming in and saying no debate.
There is no debate. And so this whole thing that we grew up with, anyone in this demographic grew up with, this thing about Voltaire saying, "I hate what you say, but I defend to the death your right to say it," which was a sort of a motto, a sort of flag-bearing motto. Yes. For
and now you have no right
to
over.
Say. That's over. That's finished, because it's not okay to say free speech trumps everything. It doesn't anymore. Not giving offense trumps everything now.
But we are almost out of time, but we have to get our Goldster thought from you, because you used to work for the oldie, didn't you, with Richard Ingram? And that is, in a way, I know you're decades away from creeping into that zone, but some of us here are moving towards it. So for people that, like all of us, like you, that have had knocks in life, and give us a tip on how to dust ourselves off and keep going.
Okay, so Richard Ingram, who founded the oldie, and I remember the morning that we met, and he said, "I'm thinking of starting a magazine. I'm going to call it the Oldie." And I said, "That's a terrible name. It will never work with that name." Of course, it's a fantastic success. And he said, "I'd like you to work for it, because I think we have the same attitude towards string." And I said, "What do you mean, Richard?" And he said, "We'd had a lunch in which we'd both discussed how if we had a spare little piece of string, we didn't throw it away. We kept it in a drawer for when you needed spare pieces of string." And he had that down as an oldie characteristic. And he gave me a column called Tips for Meanies, full of these wretched ideas. It was marvelous, actually. I loved writing. I got a book out of it.
Oh, that is brilliant. Sue says, "So interesting, thank you. We'll read the book," as does Emma, and a heap of them up there for a fantastic interview. The books are on sale, and Jane is here to talk to you and to sign them. But time's winged chariot is upon us, and we're about to step back onto the streets of 2020s London instead of 1950s London. And what alternate history, I wonder, will novelists write about this era? A great show, fantastic stories. Thank you, audience, for being here and for your questions. Until next week with Peter Popham and India, stay active, stay curious, stay generous, stay involved, stay alternate, and of course, stay Goldster. Thank you, Jane Thynne, for an incredible, fantastic interview.
That was so much fun. Thank you. Really enjoyed that.